Well, thank you all so much for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak at the symposium this morning. It's a great pleasure. In the short time that we have, I was asked to talk a little bit about rabies prevention and control. And again, some of the information was very aptly introduced in Jesse's talk, and we'll talk a little bit more about the frame around rabies prevention and control. So in the short time we have here this morning, here's the objectives of our session. We're going to look at what is the target of rabies prevention in general, and how rabies epidemiology actually helps us hit that target, improves our aim so that we actually are hitting the target. And then we'll talk a little bit about rabies prevention strategies, both from kind of a 10,000-foot view, kind of a more general or global, holistic perspective about rabies prevention, and then kind of a ground level view for some of the prevention activities again, that we deal with every day in a state health department in Georgia, and tell you a little bit about how we try to get the word out about those prevention strategies. And then we'll talk just very, very briefly about some prevention for actually only one of rabies new tricks. I'm going to let Dr. Vora tell you about another major new trick later today, so I'll tease that for you. So in any case, we hear about, and in Jesse's talk he said the same way, rabies is a preventable viral disease. You can see on the CDC website. And again, rabies in humans is 100% preventable through appropriate medical care, et cetera. So obviously the concept of prevention is core to how we approach rabies. But what really is our prevention target? And if you're really going to hit the bullseye here, really the ultimate target is to prevent human rabies cases, at least from a public health standpoint. So for our mission, really the prevention activities that we undertake with a variety of different partners, our goal is ultimately to prevent human rabies cases. But how do we improve our aim? How do we actually hit this target? And really, again, you'll hear the foundation, the mantra of this talk really will be that the success of any disease containment strategy must be founded upon epidemiology and surveillance. So in order to hit that rabies prevention target, we have to have core animal and human rabies surveillance mechanisms in place that are going to be able to guide and target again, our interventions and our control measures to, again, ultimately prevent human rabies cases. So again, if we think about rabies epidemiology, again, as we know, really understanding rabies epidemiology, and you got an appreciation for how the epidemiology changes over time, with both host factors and, again, factors of the virus itself, understanding the epidemiology of rabies in a given area really is the foundation for how we recognize risk factors and then how we subsequently control them. So clearly there will be different prevention strategies when we're talking about a developing country, when we're talking about worldwide, and we're talking about the United States or even in a rural area within a state, such as in Georgia, for example. So again, I'm not going to reiterate a lot of what Jesse talked about, but again, I'm just going to highlight the main points. So when we're thinking about using epidemiology to drive and target our prevention, clearly when we think about rabies epidemiology worldwide, we're talking about dog. Absolutely, you've heard that before, and you realize that human rabies clearly is a huge public health issue around the world. Again, as Jesse had mentioned, more than 55,000 human rabies cases around the world. And we're really talking about, again, the primary exposures and the primary animal reservoir is canine rabies worldwide. And when we think about in the US, it's primarily a wildlife disease. Dog rabies transmission has been eliminated, but here in the US, we primarily have wildlife reservoirs with a subsequent domestic animal and human spillover infections. So our wildlife hosts or reservoirs that you saw in the previous talk obviously include raccoons, skunks, foxes, mongooses, and bats. And human rabies is relatively uncommon here in the US and most often associated with either bat exposures or international dog exposures, exposures to dogs abroad or in other ways as well. So when we're thinking about focusing on prevention for human rabies in the US, what we really have to worry about are bat exposures or international dog exposures. Easy, I like to use cartoons to make a point. So let's think about how we're going to use that epidemiology, those core patterns, to drive our prevention. So let's start worldwide, and let's start with really just a global 10,000-foot view of how we approach rabies prevention. Clearly, it's the holistic way to look at it is really to create that barrier between animal rabies and people. And it involves a variety of, again, high-level components, including people, ongoing research, education, vaccination, improving access to treatment around the world, and at its core, diagnostic surveillance in animals. So again, really, the way to approach it that has had a tremendous amount of success. I'm sure many of you are familiar with World Rabies Day that has been, instituted since 2007. And again, the Global Alliance for Rabies Control, these multidisciplinary partnerships that really form international advocacy agendas and really effective blueprints for control. It's been a major game changer. And again, from that 10,000-foot view, it's a very appropriate strategy. Clearly, again, not a single area or developing country can do it alone, but again, has these resources available. So that's the kind of global 10,000-foot view. Now let's just take a look at prevention strategies kind of on a day-to-day, ground-level basis that we deal with in the US in a state health department. And you'll see that rabies prevention really is tiered. It's got a variety of building blocks that you can see here. You can't have rabies prevention without all of these tiers to make up this. And really the foundation that holds it all together, this pole here, is what? Animal and human rabies surveillance. That's what holds it together. So all prevention strategies are going to be driven by and guided by surveillance activities. So what we'll do in the talk is we'll just talk a little bit about some of these building block components of prevention, some of them in a little more detail than others. And again, some of them will be covered in some of the other talks in more detail, and some were even covered in Jesse. So let's take a look, first of all, at animal and human rabies surveillance. I'll just give you one example, Georgia example, of how we use surveillance data and animal rabies surveillance data to guide and inform our prevention activities. So this map really just shows you, again, if we map out and look at animal rabies cases, this is in South Georgia, in what we call our Waycross district in Southeast Georgia. And if we look at kind of mapping out the number of rabies cases, they're all raccoon, as you can see here, but mostly all raccoon. But if you kind of look at these sort of hot spots of locations, it's a very rural, again, area in Georgia. So clearly, some of this is really going to reflect where some of the higher population centers are, although they're still not very high population by any means. But it helps us identify locations at risk, and it helps our local health departments sort of target their domestic animal vaccination clinics that they sponsor in partnership with veterinary clinics, and also educational campaigns kind of in these areas where they see the most cases. Again, not anything, again, that should be all that earth-shattering, but really, again, using surveillance to drive and allocate resources for prevention, especially in an area like this. So now let's take a look at the next prevention strategy, just briefly. One of the building blocks, let's look at domestic animal vaccination. And again, for us, the way that I'm going to approach some of these slides, again, we do an awful lot of education at the state health department level for all of the partners involved in rabies control. So again, a lot of the time, what we try to do is this kind of outreach to veterinarians, to local health departments, to our Georgia Poison Center, who again assists us with taking rabies questions and rabies calls. So in any case, let's talk just a little bit about how we approach education about domestic animal vaccination. Again, clearly this is pre-exposure for them, and really again forms the key barrier between wildlife rabies in the U.S. and people. So in Georgia, by law, all dogs and cats and ferrets, for that matter, must be vaccinated against rabies. That's the OCGA statute that you see there. That again just tells you what law it falls under. And again, depending on the vaccine and the vaccine label, again, typically these animals are vaccinated at 3 months of age. Some vaccines are licensed to be used in younger animals. And then they are boosted they're boosted definitely a year later, and then either annually or triennially, depending on if it's a 1-year or 3-year rabies vaccine. We also promote that valuable livestock or livestock that, again, are involved with frequent contact with people, livestock shows, on display. You'll hear a nice story from Dr. Gobble later about how this could go wrong. We recommend that those animals remain vaccinated against rabies, and we consider an animal to be currently vaccinated if the rabies vaccine was given at least 28 days prior and was administered properly. One thing that we offer, again, as far as a lot of education, we get a lot of questions about how to use or whether it's appropriate to use anti-rabies antibody titers in animals for management as far as their immune status. And we spend a lot of time, again, educating veterinarians and pet owners and others involved in rabies management, animal control issues, that titers really should not be used, to determine the immediate immune status, again, of a dog, cat, or ferret for that matter. Again, there are more than just the humoral immunity involved. There is not really a kind of exact number where the titer is equal to a level of protection. There's cellular immunity and other immunity, and titers do wane over time. So again, we educate our folks not to use titers to determine whether or not the dog who may have an allergic reaction to its last rabies shot, whether it can get another one, whether it's considered to be immune. Again, that is not the way to do that. So let's take a look at, just briefly, without a whole lot of detail, one of the other building blocks in rabies prevention, and that is appropriate animal management of animals that have either been potentially exposed to rabies by wildlife or other vectors, or animals that bite humans. So if we take a look at, again, the sort of recommended management, and all of these recommendations are part of our national recommendations, the National Compendium for Animal Rabies and Control, that is, again, adopted in practice most everywhere around the United States. So in any case, if we think about how we usually approach domestic animals in Georgia that are exposed to rabies or potentially exposed to them by a wild animal, when we think about one question that we get a lot, really the wild animal is really going to be the highest risk, clearly, when we think about the epidemiology. But we get a lot of questions about whether or not, a dog-to-dog encounter or a cat fight, may in fact necessitate some sort of management of that animal to observe it for signs of rabies. And we really don't consider that to be a high risk. Again, typically these encounters, when we look at the number of dog rabies cases, the number of cat rabies cases, even in Georgia, again, if these animals are otherwise healthy and are behaving in a way, that seems to be normal within the realm of why they would be having this kind of fight or this encounter, provoked, if you will, we don't consider it to be, a management where we need to actually observe the animal for signs of rabies. But we do get a question about that quite often. So let's take a look a little bit at domestic animals that are exposed to rabies, primarily from wildlife, not from domestic. That's my cat, E.T. He's hairless, but that's why he has to wear a sweater at all times. But he is vaccinated. But if he weren't, if he were exposed to a wild animal, again, a rabies vector, a raccoon, either again, one that has tested positive for rabies or one that we assume would be rabid if we don't have it available for testing, such as a raccoon. Again, for unvaccinated dogs and cats, we either consider euthanasia or a 6-month strict isolation period with the appropriate vaccination, either upon entry to the 6-month isolation period or at month 5, so that they're current when they come out of the isolation period. And what we find, kind of in practice, at least in Georgia, from local animal control agencies and local health department environmental health folks, is that, again, there are a variety of ways that this is accomplished in practice as far as the actual isolation itself. It used to be in Georgia that it was mandated that there was a specific size of pen with a cement floor and a certain height of double barrier kind of wall fence around the pen. But now we see that isolations that again, obviously this isolation period would approximate the incubation period of rabies. So we're trying to monitor this animal to see if it goes on to develop signs and symptoms of rabies, so that it's in one place, we know where it is, that it hasn't escaped, gotten loose, and potentially exposed other animals or people. But again, in practice, we see isolations actually administered in a variety of ways. Again, in veterinary clinics, in other types of pens, and our local health departments work closely with the owners of the animals to try to accomplish this. It's easy if the animal is already vaccinated, like E.T. If he were exposed to a raccoon, then all we would have to do is give him a booster dose of rabies vaccine and monitor him at home kind of normally for a 45-day period, just to ensure that in fact, even though we assume that, again, his rabies biologics are going to be highly potent, highly immunogenic, he should be good to go, especially with the anamnestic response of that booster dose of vaccine. But just in case, for whatever reason, we're going to monitor him at home and recommend to the owners that they don't kind of get rid of the animal, give it to somebody else at that time, during that time frame at all. And so what we also get lots of questions about health department wise is, what if my dog or cat has a quote-unquote expired vaccine that may be expired a day, a month, a week? It varies, maybe longer than that. And again, as you know, as talking about biology, right on that exactly that 1 year or 3 year period on that given day, the immunity just doesn't stop. It can vary. So in any case, we really consider that on a case-by-case basis. For animals that have kind of very recently out-of-date vaccinations, we consider them current, really. But again, we recommend that they consult with us at the health department, and we walk them through that as well. Livestock that get exposed to rabid animals, again, we really kind of do the same kind of thing. If it's vaccinated, we revaccinate and observe. If unvaccinated, we either euthanize or put it under a 6-month, kind of isolation, so that we can approximate, again, the incubation period of rabies as well. So again, nothing all that new under the sun. So that's how we manage primarily, kind of domestic animals that are exposed to wildlife rabies. But what about animals that bite humans? And again, we'll just talk a little bit about both, again, domestic animals at first and then others as well. So if a dog, a cat, or a ferret bites a human, again, the recommendation is that they need to be observed for a period of 10 days, regardless of their vaccination status. Whether they're current or not current, if they have the animal and they need to be observed for a 10-day period. So this is going to approximate not the incubation period, but the viral shedding period of rabies, right? So this, again, if we consider the bite to be a potential sign or aggression, a sign of rabies, clinical sign, then over this 10-day period, we would expect the animal to go on to develop worsening clinical signs, neurologic signs, and then would be at that first sign of illness would be tested for rabies at that point in time. So again, 10-day observation upon a bite. And again, we don't recommend that they administer rabies vaccine during this 10-day period. And again, there are not a lot of data, again, to show that it really lengthens that shedding period or anything like that. But again, the theory really is, in a practical sense, that if the animal has some sort of a a clinical or adverse reaction to the vaccine itself for some reason, it may be difficult to distinguish it from, a clinical sign of rabies, or at least the prodromal type of clinical sign. So that's the reason we recommend that if it's not vaccinated. And as far as, we get a lot of questions, at least in Georgia, about, kind of livestock that bite humans, primarily horses in various settings. We don't consider them to be high risk, but in any case, most of the time, if the animal is, again, showing signs suggestive of rabies, we might consider on a case-by-case basis looking at euthanasia and testing. Otherwise, we really just monitor it for a 45-day period or so. Sometimes that varies a little bit too. When we're thinking about really the high-risk animals that bite humans obviously are the wildlife reservoirs, the wild carnivores, raccoons, skunks, foxes. Again, they are high risk. All bites are considered possible exposures to rabies. They should be euthanized and tested if available. Many times this is not the case, but most of the time we then just consider it to be an exposure. And bats the same way. Any possible exposure at all. As Jesse had mentioned, when we look at the epidemiology of human rabies in the US, again, many of the bat exposures have been what can be in some cases termed cryptic, where there may not have been an obvious bite situation, but there may have been physical contact with a bat, or there may not be a physical bite, that's visible, but we consider that to be that, again, there may be bites that do take place, but they just are not visible. So we consider that to be a high risk. And last but not least, again, we don't consider rodents and lagomorphs to be of high risk, but we do get a lot of questions about, again, human bites involving squirrels and, mice, rats. So for us in Georgia, there are situations where, again, the animal may be behaving abnormally, or again, there may be other circumstances that sort of warrant testing. But usually we recommend that again, we sort of approve that testing before they send it to our public health laboratory. Otherwise, our public health laboratory would be overrun with a number of, rats and mice that bite people all the time, and squirrels. So again, we sort of monitor that based on risk itself. So those are kind of the most of the general categories of animals that bite humans that we are concerned about. But camels might pose a slightly different. Just a joke. All right. So in any case, let's talk a little bit about one of the other tiers of rabies prevention. And I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail here. Jesse talked a little bit about pre and post-exposure prophylaxis. But two of these tiers go together. And again, it's founded on the risk factors and epidemiology of rabies in an area. But really, conducting appropriate risk assessment in conjunction with deciding, again, whether post-exposure prophylaxis as a prevention strategy is appropriate in these situations. So these two go together. And again, when we talk about risk assessment, we really consider, again, a variety of situations, a variety of components, as again, whether it was a bite versus a non-bite exposure, the type of animal, the vaccination status of the animal, whether we have the animal available for testing, and kind of the circumstances of exposure. One thing that I know anybody in this room who has dealt with rabies questions and dealt with rabies inquiries and calls, you realize that rabies risk assessments oftentimes are almost never kind of very clearly black or white. There's a lot of gray and there's a lot of variables, and that's why again, risk assessment is again something that is appropriately done with a lot of experience, and you get pretty good at it. But most of the time, they're not black or white. Although some situations really might be pretty black or white. For example, if you have raccoon living in your vinyl couch, that's a no. All right, let's take a look at, again, just briefly, how we go about, again, doing the risk assessment for recommending post-exposure prophylaxis for a potential rabies exposure. And again, for us in Georgia, we have sort of algorithms that again mirror the national recommendations, and we really, our algorithms that are used, we really just kind of classify animals based on, again, epidemiology of rabies into either very low, low, intermediate, or high risk categories. So again, nothing all that new under the sun. For high-risk wild mammals and bats, we're really going to be really conservative about recommending post-exposure prophylaxis, especially if the animal is unavailable for testing or we consider that high risk. And if we're dealing with the more intermediate risk animals like dogs and cats, we're going to use our other management techniques that we already talked about, such as observing them for a 10-day period or testing them if appropriate. Sometimes, depending on level of risk and depending on the situation of the bite, if the animal is unavailable for testing, if it's a stray dog or stray cat, cats probably pose a higher risk in Georgia in some ways. If we have a stray cat that bit someone and we are not able to locate it, it escaped and animal control is not able to locate the animal, we can't either observe it or test it if, for that matter. Again, sometimes very conservatively, physicians will recommend post-exposure prophylaxis if we don't have an animal to deal with. And then we kind of deal with our kind of lower risk livestock and rodents and lagomorphs that we talked about before. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, again, about post-exposure prophylaxis recommendations for humans. Jesse covered that. But for the interest of being complete, as part of, again, all of these tiers and these building blocks of rabies prevention, again, keep in mind that we do have effective post-exposure prophylaxis available, and the protocol is here, again, to offer as a key component of rabies prevention once risk is appropriately recognized and assessed that this would be appropriate for treatment. We talk a little bit about pre-exposure vaccination as well for individuals at high risk. That's one of the other components. And again, Jesse covered this, so I'll just mention that again, most of the time when we're talking about pre-exposure vaccination, I concur with Jesse that one of our most common questions is from veterinarians or animal control officers who have pre-exposure, have incurred the pre-exposure series, they're previously immunized, and then they encounter a potential rabies exposure and what to do about that. And again, and the appropriate answer really is if you have a valid, appropriately risk-assessed exposure, they should get two booster doses of vaccine on days 0 and 3. But again, oftentimes we get those same questions about whether they should use their titers, their anti-rabies antibody titers on that day to determine immune status, but the answer is no. So, one of the themes of our symposium is that rabies, can an old dog do new tricks? And we know it can, absolutely. This is a new trick. This is my dog, Uncle Warren. When he rides in the car, he can't decide whether he wants to drive, see what's going on in the road in front or behind. So he tries to do a little bit of both. But let's talk a little bit about one new trick. And it's not all that new, but again, Jesse mentioned this as well. One of the more recent situations that we've encountered have been kind of military deployment related rabies. And again, considering the fact that, again, considering the epidemiology of canine rabies and other canine enzootic areas, canine rabies enzootic areas in other countries, this shouldn't really be a surprise. But there have been two, kind of relatively recent published cases of military deployment-related rabies. One, the first in 2011, was a U.S. soldier who was stationed in Afghanistan who incurred a dog bite while he was there. And again, according to the report, he reported it, but he didn't seek medical treatment. He reported it to his colleagues, and they essentially didn't necessarily recognize risk to the point where he sought medical attention, didn't receive post-exposure prophylaxis, and was unclear about wound treatment as well up front. But once he came back from his deployment, it turns out that 3 months later, he was back home in New York and went on to develop rabies. And again, and then in the second case, so a very tragic situation with that soldier, and that was really again the first human rabies case associated with active duty, at least that has been reported. And in the second case, it wasn't a human case of rabies, but in fact was importation of a dog that had been a pet, with servicemen who had adopted them in Iraq. And again, at this point in time, they brought a whole group of these pets back because the servicemen had returned back home. And again, one of these dogs, it was an 11-month-old dog, actually became ill and rabies was diagnosed at that time, and again was a canine variant from the Middle East. So again, these situations are real. They're absolutely real risks. But again, the prevention strategies that surround these kind of tragic scenarios, if we just are going to be focused on and driven by epidemiology. This is canine rabies and zoonotic area, so it's not all that new under the sun. Even though it's a kind of a new trick as far as rabies goes, the prevention recommendations are the same. They're driven by, again, the same type of rabies risk awareness. This is a canine rabies area. This what I wanted to show you here. I probably can't read it too well, but the military, as part of the response to the 2011 human rabies case in the soldier, sent this memo and again sent this document. It's publicly available. You can find it online. This is from the Department of Defense. It really kind of outlines protocol for how service personnel and military personnel, how exactly what they should do. As far as prevention recommendations, as far as animal rabies goes in areas where canine rabies is prevalent. And so again, it talks about the same thing, ensuring that military personnel have appropriate either pre-exposure immunization, have a protocol in place to report any animal bites, prevention of, avoidance of dogs in these areas, and again, having a protocol in place where they have this risk-based post-exposure prophylactic, at least consultation available to them, if they were to tell their commanding officer. So again, that just wanted to highlight, no matter what, the kind of whatever the wrinkle in the rabies situation, again, the prevention recommendations are really going to be driven by, again, that same tier, all of those building blocks. I would like to conclude my talk with giving you some resources for us in Georgia. Dr. Julie Gobble is our state public health veterinarian. You'll be hearing from her later in the symposium. And Melissa Ivey, our rabies epidemiologist, you'll be hearing from her later as well. That's my contact information there. And again, we have a rabies control manual, as most state health departments do, that again highlights a lot of the things that we just talked about, and is used very commonly by animal control agencies and local health departments in Georgia as well. And I will just conclude. This is Uncle Warren. You can get a better close-up of him. He's not rabid most of the time. And this is E.T. again. He's not rabid either, but this one really is. And that's not mine. This was a rabid cat that was diagnosed in Gwinnett County last year. Was in somebody's house. A situation. I'm pretty fascinated by pictures of rabid animals. So this one, so here's kind of a clue, but. Strange, but that again is a real rabid cat that we saw, and I would like to thank you all for your very kind attention. And if there is time, I'm happy to take questions now, but I'll be around for the entire symposium. If you have one that you think of later, you can track me down in the room or at lunch, and I'm happy to answer then as well. So.
Okay, so we have
Yes, question.
Well, you probably can't make a statement on this, but I practice over in the military areas where Camp Lejeune, and there is a huge problem I mean, do we not have enough stray dogs in our own country that they're bringing them over? Because they brought leishmaniasis in when the Army brought dogs
Absolutely.
back. And then they're bringing rabies. I think that dog broke in New York.
New York, yeah.
So was it vaccinated before it was brought over?
And you know, and clearly, and again, I think maybe Neil can talk a little bit more about, you know, CDC, so there's military policies and there's the usual federal, you know, sort of CDC quarantine policies about bringing any animal from other, you know, from other parts of the world here, where they actually, you know, again, have to have appropriate documentation and appropriate, you know, period of quarantine, really. And again, in the military, you know, perhaps, again, I think there really are, from what I could read, I don't have direct knowledge of it, it seems like they really are trying to crack down on having policies in place for this kind of thing. They recognize the issue.
I just have a really quick comment. Cherie put up the link for the Georgia Rabies Manual. I just wanted to say that I actually have some of those in my car. If anyone is interested in having a paper copy of that, I'm happy to go and get that at the end of the day. So just grab it.
Dr. Song?
Dr. Drenzek, I would like to differ a little bit in your opinion about the values of titers. You know, I would argue that we use titers in human medicine to decide if individuals should be revaccinated or not, active vaccination. So why don't we accept that for animals? You know, and some vaccine manufacturers would argue that they have good data to prove with infections, with active infections, that you know, some of the products provided titers to prevent infection. You know, three or seven up to 7 years after these individuals had been vaccinated. So why do you say there are different standards between animals and?
No, what I said was actually is that, again, it depends. You know, the titer testing, again, as far as these are sort of national recommendations from the national compendium, that again, that an individual titer, again, should not be used as a management tool to indicate absolute immunity at that time. So again, it's more of looking at, if in the testing is going to be different, it's the way the test is done. And Jesse, help me with this too. Can you, as far as, like, for example, if you're talking about a person that has had a pre-exposure series, and they have it, you know, and again, it's recommended according to national recommendations that you know, veterinarians, people at high risk, every few years have their titer run, and they can tell whether or not they need a booster dose. That is done. That again is because you're sort of looking at it over time, immunity over time. But again, as far as the point being is that there's not necessarily, you know, kind of this snapshot, you know, single level of titer that's going to indicate absolute immunity because of the other potential immune factors that are involved. Jesse, do you have anything else to add?